So we're still in Nehemiah, Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Last week we had discussed chapters 9 and 10 regarding the worship after the completion. After the completion of the walls in Jerusalem, how the people in chapter 8 really kind of begged Nehemiah to bring the Word of God. They read through it. They discovered they were to dwell in tabernacles, booths, tents. And so they went out and got those materials. And after that, there was a great resurgence, a revival, we might say, among the people there in chapter 9, and making a new covenant, if you will, with God, in putting away foreign wives and children and returning to the Lord. And in chapter 10, there is the document that is set forth, and the people sign that. So we're fast forwarding just a little bit, and when I say a little bit, I really mean just kind of a couple of paragraphs, a couple of chapters. So we're coming into this. Nehemiah, he had served as governor of Judah for 12 years. And then he returned to Persia. And some years later, he arrives back in Jerusalem. We see this in Nehemiah. If we were to go back, for example, a few chapters here in Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 14. Moreover, from the day that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 30th year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. So we have there the length of time, and if we were to skip forward to chapter 13, specifically, we're kind of going back and forth a little bit here. Sometimes we have to do that to get the full context and time. Chapter 13 and verse 6, during all this time I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave from the king. So we have there in chapter 5 and verse 14, him specifically mentioning the length of time that he was there. And then chapter 13 and verse 6, what had happened. That, he had left, he had gone back, and then he asked leave from the king. So in those intervening years, spiritual conditions in Judah had deteriorated so much that the nation was once again on the brink of adopting pagan idols. It's kind of interesting in that you have a spiritual leader there who is reading from the book of the law. He is interpreting the book of the law, but then he leaves. And so there's no one there, in a sense, to kind of take up the mantle. Now, we remember from Deuteronomy chapter 6 an obligation that the family had, that the fathers had, to teach these things to their children when they rise up, when they lie down, when they walk by the way. And so even in the absence of a quote-unquote spiritual leader of all the people like Nehemiah was, there should have still been some teaching within the household. But apparently on a broad scale that wasn't happening, because the nation has deteriorated and they're almost back to where they were in the sense of adopting these pagan gods, marrying foreign wives, and what have you. And it had the spiritual fervor that was there, it had dissipated among the people. Now, it was under things like compromise and materialism and really carnal things. Paul, he writes that the things that were written beforehand were written for our learning. And we often make that connection to typically just the Jewish people, in that the sacrificial system, the priestly system of the Old Testament, that it was a way of teaching the Jewish people that when the Messiah comes, what sacrifice would mean, what baptism would mean, what worship would mean, and reverence for God, and all of these other items. But still, we can take that also to mean, even on a broader scale, for ourselves. I've seen, I don't know if you have, when congregations have, I'll say no spiritual leadership. And when I say no spiritual leadership, I say that there's no elders there, there's no full-time minister there, and it's just kind of, men doing their thing and what have you. Now, that's not saying that men can't teach a lesson or preach a sermon. I'm not saying that. But there is a difference when you have a man who's got, a 40-hour-a-week job, and he's trying to put something together, and someone whose time is kind of dedicated to that. So without that leadership there, and without the, I've seen those congregations to where they really do just kind of crumble. And as they start to crumble, what they do is they look to outside sources that are more popular. Right? In progressive congregations, liberal congregations, whatever term you want to use. And they say, well, if we do this, we'll have more people in and what have you. Well, it doesn't matter if you're a congregation of 20 and you get 100 people in there if there's no spiritual leadership, to point to say, hey, this is what the Bible says, right? Then all you do is have 100 people worshiping in error. And so we have that here in that Nehemiah has gone, and over these years, the people, they have gotten back to almost where they were before. And then we come into Tobiah. He was an Ammonite ruler, and really he was an archenemy of Nehemiah in his efforts to secure Jerusalem. Now, Eliashib, the high priest, he had formed an alliance with him and provided actually a large room for him in the temple of God. He says, look, you don't have a place to stay, you don't have a home here. How about we give you a big room of your own in the temple? Which we know is meant to be a place of worship, a place of sacrifice. And not only that, but the Levites, they had been neglected. They were forced into fields for self-preservation. Now initially you might say, okay, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with the priest, going out into the field and having to work and what have you? Well, the main problem is that it was never God's plan. And so if we look back at a couple of verses, going all the way back to the book of Numbers, Book of Numbers, chapter 18, all the way back to the 4th book of Moses. Chapter 18 and verse 6, behold, this is Numbers 18:6. Behold, I myself have taken your fellow Levites from among the sons of Israel. They are a gift to you, dedicated to the Lord to perform the service for the tent of meeting. See, there was a division of land, right? And all of the tribes, they got a portion of land based upon their size. The Levites, those who were to be priests, anyhow, they were pulled out. They didn't receive an inheritance of land because the Lord was their inheritance. And so God here, in verse 6, he said, I have taken these Levites from the sons of Israel, but they're a gift to you. So even though I've taken them away from you in a sense, they are a gift to you. And the reason that they're a gift is, one, because they've dedicated themselves to God and to perform the service at the tent of meeting. Right? Now we go forward just a little bit here in chapter 18 to verse 24.
13.
chapter 18.
Numbers.
Yes, Numbers chapter 18, verse 24.
We're in Numbers.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Numbers 18, verse 24. For the tithe of the sons of Israel, which they offer as an offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said concerning them, they shall have no inheritance among the sons of Israel. So we have, we have the Hebrew people, the children of Israel, and we have these tribes, these 12 tribes. And the Levites, they're pulled out from that. They receive no inheritance of the land because God is their inheritance. And God says, even though I've taken them from among you, I give them to you because they are to dedicate themselves to me, and they are to perform the work that is done in the temple. Then here, the tithe of the sons of Israel that they offer to the Lord, I've given to the Levites. Now this is where, and as well as Abraham and what have you, it comes into that, you hear the 10% or the 10th or what have you. First, tithing is Old Testament principle. Tithing is not today. Tithing does not apply today. What applies today is a free will offering. What it was then, and even most people, when they say a tenth, even in congregations who still unfortunately teach this today, they've referenced it to financial, a tenth of income. Even in the Old Testament, that's not what it was. It was a tenth of everything. A tenth of income. It'd be a tenth of flock. It'd be a tenth of this. It'd be a tenth of that. It was a tenth of everything. A tenth of everything. Because when we get down to the numbers, there's around 23,000 Levitical priests. So there's a lot that needs to be provided. And the priests, they weren't to be working in the fields or anything. Why? Right, because their job was servicing God and servicing the people. And so that's why it was given to them. Let's jump over to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 9, just kind of reiterating here. Therefore, Levi does not have a portion or inheritance with his brothers. The Lord is his inheritance, just as the Lord your God spoke to him. And then we fast forward to chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, that is. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 1 through 6, really it looks at the portion of the Levites. The Levitical priests, the whole tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's offerings by fire and his portion. Notice the capital H if your translation has that. So it's talking about God's portion. So, the people, they're supposed to give to God the first fruits, right? The first of their cattle, the first of their grain, and what have you. It goes to God, and it's sacrificed and what have you, and then the priests, they eat of what is the Lord's portion. So it's not even everything it's not necessarily given to them per se, but it's more that it's given to God, and then they receive a portion of that because they have dedicated themselves to the work of God. They shall have, verse 2, no inheritance among their countrymen. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. Now this shall be the priest's due from the people, from those who offer a sacrifice, either an ox or a sheep, of which they shall give to the priest the shoulder and the 2 cheeks and the stomach. You shall give him the first fruits of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the first shearing of your sheep. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, is that there's a twofold first here. So when you look there in verse 3, the first of the animals is going to who? It's going to God. Now the priests, they receive a portion of it, the shoulders, the cheek, the stomach, right? But the first portion of grain, wine, oil, shearing of sheep, we see that's going to the priests, right? For the Lord your God, verse 5, and here's the reason that those things are going to the priests first. For the Lord your God has chosen him and his sons from all your tribes to stand and serve in the name of the Lord forever. Verse 6, now if a Levite comes from any of your towns throughout Israel where he resides, and comes whenever he desires to the place which the Lord chooses, I'll just finish verse 7 and 8. Then he shall serve in the name of the Lord his God, like all his fellow Levites who stand there before the Lord. They shall eat equal portions, except what they receive from the sale of their, received from the sale of their father's estates. Right? So we have here that the priests, they have been pulled out by God from all of the tribes, the tribe of Levi. Now remember, all of the priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. Okay? And so they're pulled out, they're priests, they don't receive any land inheritance or what have you, because the Lord is their portion. They receive the first fruits of the oil, the grain, and the shearing of the sheep and what have you. They receive a portion of what is God's also, namely the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach. So they receive this so that they can focus on the work. That's one of the reasons why they're not supposed to be out working in the fields, as we see over here in Nehemiah, which we can go ahead and turn back to. That we see there in Nehemiah. And so, if it's saying there at the end, if let's say you have a Levitical priest over in town A, and he travels to town B that's even 100 miles away, let's say, and he gets there, then he has the right to work there with the priests, and he receives an equal portion. The only thing that is unequal is what they have received in selling their father's estates. Remember, they have no land, but they do have homes. They do have inheritances from their biological fathers, or adoptive fathers. And so they sell that, and that's the unequal portion. What this person sells their land and their house and property for over here may not get the same as this person over here. So that's the inequality. Otherwise, they're to be treated equal. And so when we see Eliashib making this alliance with Tobiah, the Levites, they've been neglected. They're forced into fields for self-preservation. And so because they're out there focusing on that, they can't, lead the people or anything. They're just trying to survive. And then it also says there that the Sabbath was being neglected with labor and commerce. And the final step that always preceded idolatry had been taken in intermarriage with the heathens. But before we get to the Sabbath and the intermarriage, were there any comments or thoughts or questions?
So why do they need money?
Why did the priests need money? Well, and that's part of the thing is in maintaining, because the law in maintaining the temple, building the temple, and what have you, things deteriorate. So money is still needed to be able to do that, because it wasn't necessary. Remember, it was a king's decree that told all of the people to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, give them whatever they needed to rebuild. But there wasn't a king's decree in order to maintain. So still kind of have to maintain things, But yeah. And now eventually, that system becomes corrupt, as we see with, in the New Testament with the Pharisees and their phylacteries dangling down, and them even being able to offer, Judas 30 pieces of silver and what have you.
Okay.
That's the main thought behind it, is maintaining. And not just the temple, but the homes that the priests would also reside in. So kind of, if we were to look at it today, it would be, we still need, even though we have this building and it's already built, well, we still need to collect money to help maintain it and what have you. And the priests, it would be, we would say a parsonage, and if we were looking at Old Testament and New Testament terms. because the priests still had somewhere to live. And like the whole thing is that their work was solely to be for God, committed to God and committed to God's people. And one of the sins here that we're reading about in Nehemiah is that because they've been neglected in that regard, they've got to go out and work, and so they can't focus on kind of these other things. I'll give you an example, a modern example of kind of what this might look like. You know, I have several friends that are in preaching school, and you know, so they're like second-year students about to graduate, and so they go through and looking for work and what have you, right? And so I kind of keep an eye on the job boards for them, and if they're in that area, then I'll let them know, hey, this place in Tennessee or this place over here is hiring or what have you. But when you go through a lot of these listings, you know, responsibilities that they want the preacher to have, there are some who say, well, we want him to be on the school board. We want him to attend city council meetings. We want him to go do this. There was one that I read that said we want him active on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and everything else the kids think we need, you know. And so, and I bring those up as an example is because that's a modern congregation trying to divide out all of this stuff for their preacher to do, and then wonder why he's exhausted on a Sunday morning, you know. And so that's kind of the idea, is that here they were sent out. You know, granted, didn't have social media, but they're sent out to the field, which is a lot harder than posting on Facebook. I think we would all agree. You know, to work. And so you think when you're going sun up to sundown and you're working in a field, planting, and it's year-round because you've got planting and harvesting and all of this. When is there time really for these priests to grow spiritually, for them to sit there and explain things to the congregation or the people and what have you? And so yeah, so money needed to help maintain things. Like I said, that's the main conclusion that people reach, is to be able to maintain their own homes. Because homes had been built, the temple had been built, so the king's decree is pretty much finished. Because it was just a rebuild, you know, and so now they have to kind of maintain everything, but they're not allowed to work. It's like going through preaching school, you know, for those 2 years, you're not allowed to hold down a job. It's 100% support from either individuals or congregations. And some won't support unless you say you're going to preach afterwards. They're like, well, no, we're not going to support you unless you guarantee that you're going to end up in a pulpit somewhere. But kind of the same thing. You can't work because you can't study for, you know, 16, 17 hours a day and still hold down a job. So I don't know if that helps answer the question or not, or if it's too long of an answer. I don't know. The question was, why'd they need money if they were getting all of this stuff? And most people come down to the idea that it was maintenance of that which was already there, or what had been done.
And how did they, if they didn't have money, how did they food?
Well, you remember from the old. We're in the Old Testament. The older Testament, right? So when you look back at Numbers in Deuteronomy, we see that they would have had meat because of the shoulders, the cheek, the stomach, they got the wine and the oil. Would you prefer me to say haggis or something like that? Okay. You know? Yeah, and so they had, you know, clothes with getting the first shear of the sheep, and what have you.
And since they didn't have a wife, they had to pay somebody to make clothes for them.
They were very handy, you know. No, they made it themselves, I'm sure, probably.
Back then they did make it themselves. Probably.
Yeah.
They did. That's why I taught my 3 boys that they could do the same thing that a woman does, because there's not always going to be a woman around.
Yeah. So yeah, but they would have, yeah. And part of the reason that they would be because, you know, in the Old Testament, especially for priestly garbs, is there was not to be a mixing of certain fabrics. And so that would have been a way of them to ensure as to the purity kind of that fabric and whatnot. Yeah, guys were smart.
Sometimes. Word knows.
They
Yes,
have
I said
wives too.
You what?
They have wives.
They
Did you
did,
say
wives
they
did
didn't have
everything.
wives?
The priest,
No, I didn't say they didn't have
Oh, I
wives.
hear somebody-
Yeah, some did.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the thing with no wives was more of a Catholic thing, you
yeah.
know. And even then, it went back and forth. I mean, Catholicism had a pope that was married, you know, and had kids and all of this. So it kind of goes back and forth. But they were allowed to have wives. But no, there was more of a self-sufficiency of the individual there. Yeah.
But it also says the gatekeepers and the musicians are also there.
Yeah. Yeah, anybody having service to do with them. And in fact, you know, there are some congregations today, for example, that if they have elders, they're a large enough congregation to do so, their elders are supported,
I
You
think
know.
that's great.
because they're supposed to be dedicated to shepherding the flock. All depends. So then it says, the Sabbath being violated with labor and commerce, and the final so that you might want to jot down Exodus chapter 20. We won't get into the verses, but Exodus chapter 20, Exodus chapter 35, and Deuteronomy chapter 5. That's remembering the Sabbath, keeping it holy. You should work 6 days, rest on the seventh, and what have you. And don't want to spend a lot of time there. And then the final step that always preceded idolatry had been taken in intermarriage with the heathen. Notice that is really kind of the final step there at that time when God's people would intermarry with heathens, because people at that time especially, it wasn't so much that, you know, today you have religious people and then you've got people that are dedicated to the world. You know, you don't see many people sacrificing to Ra, you know, anymore, right, or any of the other Egyptian gods. But it was, you know, then people were very dedicated, you know, to Ra and Baal and others, to the point of sacrificing people. And so to bring in, to intermarry with someone who was not, you know, one of the chosen people of God, one of the tribes of Israel, would be to be unequally yoked. And that their gods, you know, would ultimately kind of come in. And whether it would be an Israelite woman marrying a pagan man, you know, and her trying to do the godly thing and submitting to him, and he brings in these gods, or whether it was a Hebrew man married to, you know, this pagan woman, and who, you know, what is it? Woman is the neck that, the man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck that turns the head, right? That type of thing. And so it kind of causes him to go that way. And even the family, you look that even the family of the high priest was afflicted with this. And so Nehemiah, he confronts each departure from God's way, trying to get rid of the evil and restoring God's way, God's favor toward the people. I mean, think of a congregation that is, even today, that's maybe, you know, they're not, and forgive me, I'll just use this word, corrupt, in just one way. Right? It's, let's say, okay, over here we've got people who are living together, having kids together, but they're not married. right? Over here, we've got people who are addicted to pornography. Over here, we've got people that are drug users. Over here, we've got people who are trying to say that baptism isn't necessary for forgiveness. Over here, we've got people trying to bring in mechanical instruments, you know. And so it's not just one thing. And so it would be kind of like a preacher coming in and saying, okay, what are we going to deal with first? You know? And so kind of going after things one by one. Let's face it, that is not going to be met with any type of love or thankfulness at all. It's going to generally be met with, we hired this guy and all he seems to be doing is causing division. Because no one had a problem with it before, you know. But it's just because no one had an issue with it, just like during Nehemiah's time, these people didn't have a problem with the priests working in the field. They didn't have a problem with the Sabbath being neglected. They didn't have a problem with, you know, people going out and marrying into these pagan nations and bringing in gods. And they didn't have a problem with it. So when Nehemiah steps up, it's probably this man's causing some division. He's causing some problems. We were all getting on before. Yes, ma'am.
So what kind of time period did it take for them to get off of beaten path?
After it was built and he starts back up, because he was there for 12 years.
I want to know how long it was for them to get here, where we're talking about.
It's in those 12 years that he was there.
Okay.
You know, it's in those 12 years that he was there that you know, things started to take a turn, and it wasn't because he was neglectful in his duties. It was because we had, you know, an Ammonite ruler making deals with high priests and what have you. You know, so kind of people people in higher earthly authority working behind the scenes to try to corrupt. You know. And it's kind of, if you've got person A, B, and C, and B is the problem, then what you do, if you're person A, is you go to person C. And that way the problem starts from the ground up. While he's dealing with all of this down here, you're up there just continually causing problems. So that's kind of the situation here, is that Nehemiah, he's the middleman. He's got these higher rulers over here, and then he's got the rest of the people here. Now his responsibility is to all people, but the problem is coming from those that are, and I hesitate to say this, those that are beneath him, in the sense that they are not priests, and that they're supposed to be listening to him and what have you. So it's during that time, that 12 years, you know. Good question though. And so, you know, he's attacking these things one by one. And when we look at what he had, okay, now how do we imagine he might be attacking all of these different sins? Do we think, and obviously with words, but what words did he have? But the books of Moses, right? I don't know when the last time you read through the 5 books of Moses, read through the Torah, you know, maybe it's been a little bit since, you know, start of the year's gone, and you probably got through them already in your reading. But that is not fluffy, happy-go-lucky butterflies and rainbows. Well, except in the flood, right? You know, it's not. And now God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But, you know, when we look, for example, and we look at the New Testament, we can be, preachers can tend to be, I don't want to say more compassionate, but I'll say less fire and brimstone, if that makes sense. You know? Whereas this would, the preaching of Nehemiah, it would have been more fire and brimstone, but with compassion, with tears, with pleading. But it was calling a spade a spade. This is sin, and that's what it is. And you need to stop. you know? It was that
Did he work
simple.
with the people? You think he went and just talked to people and let the officials alone? I mean,
Well, it depends, well, no, I mean, it was more that that was his focus, because, you know, we have an Ammonite ruler, not a Hebrew ruler. He's against God, he's against Jerusalem. We have Eliashib, who's a high priest, but he is chaining himself to evil, you know? And so it's kind of, okay, because it's just like the rulers. If you can convince the people on the bottom rung of the ladder to do whatever you want, then you don't have to worry about the second, third, and fourth rung, because they'll be busy dealing with the bottom rung. And so just like today, I'll just use the example of an election, right? We can sit there and argue left and right about what happens in the executive branch or the legislative or the judicial and what this congressman or congresswoman here is doing and blah, blah. We can argue about that all day long. But if you want any type of actual change, if you want the office to change or what have you, then you don't go to the office. You go to the people, and that shows in its, you know, when there's another election, right? So it's kind of, if he wants these people to change and get back to God, then focus there, you know? And that'll take, God's going to take care of everything else. So kind of that type of mentality. But yeah, he would go through and try to get rid of much evil as he could. And let's face it, the lessons were not always well received. They were not happily received, that's for sure. You know, even though what he was doing was right. And even as he started there in chapter 13, and notice the very last verse, verse 31. I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. But then he closed with a very simple prayer. Remember me, oh my God, for good. You know, no matter what the trial was, no matter what was happening, remember me for what I have tried to do. Right? Any closing thoughts or comments? Okie dokie then. Well, our time is up. Thank you very much for your kind attention, for your questions, your commentary. Appreciate it very much.